to hear a story of a mad woman, have you? You think I do not know that that is what they call me? Behind my back, never to my face, but I have heard it said that they call me Mad Anne. Speak of madness, you know nothing. I was not born that way. Hardly. I was a child like any other, born in Liverpool, England, to two fine parents, my father a soldier, and it was my father who insisted that I should be called Anne, named after the good queen herself. Another thing that my father insisted upon is that I should learn to read and to write, for as a soldier my father had seen that a man or a woman could attain far more if they knew what it was that they made their mark upon a piece of paper than those who could not. And so he insisted that I should learn to read and to write, and I did well indeed. My mother, she surely did love that man. 'Twas truly the breaking of her heart, for when he was called up, you know that he went, as any man does. And when he was called up, my mother, she said to him the last words. She did not say goodbye. No. She said to him to fare well. For wasn't that what she wished? That he should fare well? But he did not. Indeed, he did not return. And my mother, 'twas her undoing. And she too passed on just shortly after him. And I was alone. And it is about that time that stories begin to be told about me. Oh, and I've heard them. Certainly I have. I hear what is said behind my back. It is said that it was at that time that I, as a schoolgirl, was walking along and I was kidnapped. They say I was kidnapped and brought to this country to pay off an indenture. I can assure you, I have never been kidnapped. I have never gone anywhere that was not of my choosing. I was not kidnapped. Or perhaps you've heard another story. Perhaps what you heard is that I sold myself as an indenture to come to this country. Hardly. I did not sell myself. Given a time or two. But I have never sold myself. I was not indentured to come to this country. Hardly. It was my father's pension. I paid to come to this place, and it was with employment that I came. I had arranged ahead of time with the Bell family, whom my own family had known in Liverpool. They hired me because they had two small children, and knowing full well that I could read and write, they hired me to bring those children up and to be able to do the same. And so I'll not trouble you to tell you about that vile trip from England to the James River. If you've ever heard, I've heard a story by a woman named Maggie Delaney. She will tell you what it is like to take that trip on the ocean. But suffice it to say, it is not for the weak of heart or the weak of stomach. But when I came to this land, the James River, and to Staunton, I was employed. I remember those children so well, a boy and a girl, one for each hand. And I taught them well, as I was hired to do. But more than that, I loved those children, and I took them near on everywhere that I went. And I remember a fine day in Staunton. We were walking along he here and she there. Off we were walking. And it was that day that I happened to see a young man. I don't mind telling you, I believe I caught his eye too. For it wasn't long before he was walking along beside us. And do you know, with no letter of introduction and no introduction whatsoever or intercession, that young man, he stepped right up to me, bold as brass, and he said, "I am Richard Trotter." And I said, "My goodness, well, good day to you, sir. I'm Anne Hennis." And we walked together. He had been a soldier, you see. I had a fondness for soldiers. Just my father was a soldier. And we walked together. We walked together again. And soon, we were doing a bit more than walking. It wasn't long before Richard Trotter, he asked me to marry him. And I said, of course that I would. He did not ask my father, for my father was gone. He did not ask Mr. Bell, he was not my father. He asked me. Certainly I did say yes. That man. Do you see that bit of blue there beyond the mountain? That was the color of his eyes. The blackest hair. He did indeed turn my head. And he and I, we cleared land to build a cabin. And I remember still the work that we did together. All these many years later, it's not the blisters on my hands that I remember. Oh, it was hard work, and there were many blisters. 'Tis not the blisters that I remember. It was the fine times. We had them. We built that cabin and every piece of furniture inside of it. And late in the night, we'd rest together beside the fire. And my Richard, he would tell me the tales of when he had been with Braddock. Aye, with Braddock, and I know you know of that, along the Monongahela River. And my Richard, he had, I would say that they were scars on him. They were not scars that you could see. Hardly. They were scars of another type. They were the scars of battle. They were scars from what he had seen, what he had witnessed.
Yes, sir. Artillery detail.
I remember holding him through the night. And he would tell me with all vehemence, "Anne, you must always, always be prepared. For you know not when, but you know that it will come. There are dangers that surround us, and you must always be prepared." And I listened and I nodded my head and I believed him. It wasn't long before our son William was born. That lad, the day that he was born, I looked into his eyes and they were that same blue like the sky and the blackest hair you ever saw on a wee babe. I love that boy. And I think perhaps it was having a child, having a son of his own, that made my husband that much more concerned for our welfare. And he came home one day and he brought me this fine rifle gun. And he said, "Anne, from this day forward, I don't want it to be farther than a hand's reach from you. For as I've told you, you must always be prepared. You'll hear it. You could hear just a snap, a crack, a sound behind you that you weren't expected. and it is then that you'll want that rifle gun at your hand. And he taught me fair well how to shoot it, and to maintain, and to keep it. And I don't mind telling you, I was fair good at it. In fact, my husband, he was a braggart. I don't mind saying it. He was a braggart. He was always there at the Clendenin settlement. He and George Clendenin, it was his best man. He would always say, that Anne of mine, she could shoot anything. And indeed it's true. If I put my sights on something, it was sure to come down. I often said that I could shoot the eye out of an owl across the Elk River. And I could, if I chose to. Indeed, George and Richard, those men, they were always together and talking. And Richard would say, it's not just her shooting that I have to tell you about, it's the tracking too. For if there is anything that bleeds, my Anne could track it down. And it was true. Oftentimes when my husband and I and William, we would go off hunting together, it was I who was putting the meat in the larder. But always, always, my rifle gun at reach. Because in those days, no settlement was safe from the raids of the Shawnee. You may have heard of the raids that were indeed massacres. Indeed. For the Shawnee are a wretched sort. And they pursued, and the things that they did, it would turn your stomach. I heard tell of a woman who had her child dangled by the foot. They held that child and they poked it and they prodded it. And you know what the savage said? He said that if the calf bawls, the cow will come. And when the woman did not heed the cry of her child, that savage dashed it upon a tree and killed it. That is what the savages are like. They are called savages because they are. And the massacres and the raids and the battles, they went on. And soon enough, Lord Dunmore, I can hardly have that man's name in my mouth. Lord Dunmore, he called up and he said, it is time for a battle. We will gather up in Augusta County. And all the men of Clendenin settlement, oh, huzzah, huzzah, they said, we will fight. And I guess you know that my husband did too. Well, of course he did. Every man from 16 to 60 went to sign their mark on that paper. I remember so well that day. George Clendenin came riding up on his horse, and Richard was coming out of our home. And William, he was there, and he said, I will go, I will fight the savages, Papa. And Richard said, no, you are but 7 years old. And I need you to stay here. You are now the man. You are the man of our home, and you must take care of your mother. My little man, didn't he stand straight up and he said, yes, sir, I will take care of her. And I was proud. I was proud. And when my husband stepped up onto his horse and I handed him his hat, that red cockade, I looked up. I said farewell. I said farewell. And as you know, even when the men are gone, the work must still be done. The harvest was nearly on, and so it was that William and I did as every other settler did. We carried on. We did the chores, we did the work that had to be done. They had not been gone even a month. I remember so well that day. I was baking bread, and I was kneading the dough, and William was outside. I glanced outside, and I saw a lone rider. I recognized George Clendenin right off. And I set that bread aside and I called out to William, "Come inside right now, young man, come in." And he did, he came in, he came running. He knew by my voice that there was something. And I told him to bar the door, William, for I will not be receiving callers today. There's no one with whom I wish to speak. And I beg you to forgive him because he was a good lad. He was. But when he looked outside and he saw his father's dearest friend, he did not bar the door. I turned my back and I picked up that bread. And George Clendenin came into my home and he said to me, Anne, I've hard news. Didn't I already know? Didn't I know that October my husband would not be coming home? I told George Clendenin to get out of my house. And he said, Anne, I have to tell you, I could not bring your husband home. I could not bring him home. And you would not have recognized him if I had. Not recognized him? How could that be? How could I not recognize my husband? What could those savages have done to him that I would not recognize him? How dare he not bring my husband home to me? But he did not. He said, I've brought you all that I could. He put it in my hands. He said, get out. I never wish to speak with you again, George Clendenin. Get out of my home. And my son and I held him. I held him like he was a babe again. And he fell asleep in my arms, tears on his cheeks. I picked him up. The fire had gone cold. I tucked him into the bed that I had made with my hands, with my husband. Tucked him in. And I chanced to spy my husband's hunting frock. And it still smelled of him. I know not what possessed me, but I put it on, and it was as if his arms had wrapped around me. I could feel him there with me. You speak of madness. You know nothing of madness. You know nothing of sitting in the home that you have made, knowing that your husband will never return. That night, I sat beside a cold fire, and I stared into the darkness. And it was at that time that I believe the darkness came into me. So you say, is she mad? Is she mad as though she is angry? Or is she mad as if she has lost her mind? And on that night, it was as though I had lost my mind. For when my son awoke the next morning, he found his mother strangely clad, wearing sturdy boots, his father's hunting frock, his hunting knife as well. When my son awoke, I said to him, William, gather up all that you wish to have. We will not be returning here. And he gathered up his things, his belongings. I told him to go outside. I told him to get out, and I would attend to him shortly. And I went to that fireplace. I found just a small ember or two. I reached in and I gathered it up, and I blew it into a flame, and the brightness, it engulfed me, and I held it to the candle, and then I put it into the bed there, and the quilt began to burn, and the tick burned, and I watched it, and it was everything that I had built gone in an instant. I stepped outside and I locked the door, for if this were not my home any longer, it would be none. I would never have a home again. William, he looked at me so strangely, and I could not. I was not his mother anymore. Indeed, I could not be his mother, for I could not be Anne. I took his hand, and I walked with him. I walked him 13 miles to our nearest neighbor, Mrs. Mann, for she had had a child, a son, just like my own, that she had sent out to go gather wood, just as I have done, as you have done. She had sent her son out to gather wood, only her son never returned. And I held my son's hand, and we walked, nearly silent. When we arrived at the Mann household, I beg you to forgive me. I said to her, I cannot take this boy. I cannot take this child. And I do not ask that he replace your own, but I beg you that you should rear him in a God-fearing home, for I cannot. And I left him. My son, who had lost his father, he lost his mother too. I turned my back and I walked. I walked to the Clendenin settlement and I shouted out, George Clendenin, I'll have a word. I'll have a word with you, sir. He came out and he said, what is it, Anne? What is it? And I said, I will go. I will fight. I will take back all that has been taken from me and 10 times more. And George Clendenin, you know that I can do it. Haven't you always heard that I can kill anything that I should put my sights on? Haven't you heard that I can track anything? Well, I will fight. And he looked at me and he said, Anne, have you lost your mind? You cannot go fight. You're not going to go join with the men to go fight the savages. I know well that you can hunt. I know well that you can shoot anything that you point your fine rifle gun at. But you are not going to march with the men. And I was so angry. And what he gave me instead was an opportunity not to take the life of one for one, but to save the lives of many. For he had a letter he requested that I deliver to Governor Henry Lee at the Virginia War Department. And he begged to me, he said, Anne, with a letter such as this, you can gather more men who will fight those savages, and we will win. We will fight them, but we need more men. We need more rifles. And a letter such as this can assure it. I was not persuaded. But also in that pocketbook, showed me a letter with a black seal upon it. And the letter was from Dr. Roberts to a Madam Hummel. And didn't I know full well what would be inside? And what news a letter such as this would carry to her? That she now, a widow such as I. And I said yes. I said yes, I will go and travel fort to fort. I will deliver these messages, and any letters that I should be trusted with will never reach any hands other than those which they are destined for. I will, indeed. And so I picked up my rifle gun, and I walked from fort to fort, Fencastle, all over Augusta County, and I delivered those messages. And I hunted along the way, and I provided meat for those men that they should fight. And as I stopped at homes, and I told the people there within of the tortures and the evils that had been wrought, more men joined up, and more men fought. Indeed they did. And you may ask yourself, how is it possible that a woman should travel alone by herself in those wretched times? How is it that she was not captured by Indians? And I'll tell you, there was a time when I nearly was. Indeed, I had a horse at that time, and I was riding a path that I had been on many a time before. And as I was going along, I heard it. And it was as if I could hear my husband speaking to me. He said, Anne, pay attention. Think of what you've just heard. And I looked behind me, and off in the distance I saw those savages riding behind me. And I whipped that horse. I whipped it and I whipped it again. And as it ran, it crested this hill. And didn't I know that there had been a sycamore tree that had fallen? I got to the crest of the hill, and just as I got to the sycamore tree, I leapt from the horse. And into that sycamore I crawled. And I lay there. And I could hear my heart pounding. And truly I did not know, was it the pounding of my heart, or was it the hoofbeats of those savages who are chasing me? I lay there silently, and I heard a halloo, a huge halloo, halloo, when they captured my horse, a fine prize, indeed. But I waited. And as darkness fell, those savages, they celebrated late into the night over the fine prize of my horse. And as the blackness of night overcame me, and the blackness of the earth, I began to spread it upon my face. And all that was white within me and without became covered in blackness, and I waited until those dogs were sleeping. And quiet as a mouse, I crawled out. And you may think that I would be satisfied merely to have my horse and my hair. But I was not. I had pledged that I would take back 10 times for what I had lost. And that night, I took back over and over again. And you know that those silly savages, those children, they think that the silver that they wear in their noses and in their ears, they think it will protect them from evil. Well, it does not. When that evil is steel. And over I plunged my knife into them. All save one. One, I did not take his life. That he should tell the tale of a woman who was so possessed, a woman who was so mad that she took the lives of other men without thinking twice about it. And that man, he went on back to the Shawnee villages, and he told others of the White Squaw of the Kanawha Valley, a woman who was possessed, a woman who was not to be touched, for fear that the evil that was in me might escape into them. Indeed, you speak of madness. You say mad, Anne. Indeed, I was angry. And during that time, it was not just the red savages, the red men that we were fighting. It was my own countrymen. Men in red coats we were fighting as well. And we fought. And I know, the fine soldiers that you are, you know that we fought and fought until we won. And I went to many a tavern, and I lifted many a dram. And I told a story or two. And do you know what happens when you tell a story or two? Another dram. And another story. And another dram. But this particular night, after a few, I happened to be sitting there when my eye was caught by a young man. Now, though we were both in our 40s, it was like as if I was a schoolgirl, for he caught my eye. And it wasn't long before he was sitting there beside me, and we were telling stories. And soon, we were doing more than telling stories. John Bailey, he was a ranger. That man, he was a fine man. He did not ask me to give up anything. He knew that I would not live in a cabin. I would not stop my deliveries. I would not live in a home again. He didn't ask me to give up anything. He asked me to marry him. And I guess you know that I did. Indeed. And John and I, we traveled together. Oftentimes we were together on the trail, but just every once in a while we would be separated for a while, and that was fine. He knew that I could take care of myself, and I didn't have fears for him. And there came a time when we were both at Fort Lee. Now, Fort Lee had previously been called the Clendenin Settlement, but now 'twas Fort Lee. And do you know who was there? It was Colonel Clendenin. Colonel. War does great things for some men. Well, Colonel Clendenin, he had been there, and he said to me, Anne, I need you to gather up the people. Gather everyone to the fort yard. Something in his tone hearkened to another time. And I called out to everyone to come and to gather in the fort yard. And George, he stepped forward into the throng of people gathered just as you are today, and he said to them, I have hard news. My heart stopped. He said that the Shawnee had gathered and that the Rangers had given tell that they had planned to attack our fort. And worst news of all, that we had no powder. The magazine was empty. And do you understand what it is? If there is no gunpowder, you have not a fine rifle gun. You have not your musket. You have not your cannon. You have nothing without the powder. And I watched as the men, they looked to their wives, and their wives, they saw fear in their husbands' eyes. I looked around, and what I saw was fear. It turned my stomach. I waited to hear one man to step forward and to say that they would go to Fort Savannah, for wasn't it a supply fort? And wouldn't there be gunpowder there? But 100 miles away, I waited. Not one man stepped forward. I told George Clendenin to meet me by my fire. And when he arrived, he found that I had my hands deep into the blackness of the pitch, and that I was covering every inch of me that was white. I covered myself in blackness. And I said to him, I will go. I will ride. The white squaw of the Kanawha Valley, I shall not be touched. I shall not be molested, and I will not be stopped before I bring back the powder with which we will fight. And the men, they gave up a big cheer. Huzzah! Huzzah! And I leapt upon the blackest horse that they had there. And the men, they threw open the gates. And as I came out of the fort, huzzah, they said, and I screamed out into the night that the Shawnee might hear me. 'Tis the white squaw of the Kanawha Valley. It is Anne, and I shall not be molested. And I rode that horse 100 miles. I did not stop. I did not rest. I rode and I rode until I arrived. And at Fort Savannah, I called out, huzzah, men, it is I, Anne Bailey. I have news, hard news. And the men, they opened the gates to me. And when I came inside and I told them that we were without powder and a nigh on attack any day now, the men, they came forward, and from their own powder horns, they offered powder. From the mother horn, they offered it to me. From the kegs they offered their powder. We gathered up all that we could. And do you know, they offered me an escort back to Fort Lee. I declined. I could travel on my own much more quickly than I could being lollygagged by some escort. And I rode that horse back with the powder. And when I arrived at Fort Lee with the precious powder, "Huzzah the fort!" I cried out. "It is I, 'tis Anne Bailey, and I've come with the powder." And the men, they threw off their hats and they cheered. 3 cheers for Anne. Hip, hip.
Huzzah!
Hip, hip.
Huzzah!
Hip, hip.
Huzzah!
Indeed, we cheered. But it was not a cheer for long, for we had fighting to do. And do you think that it is only men that fight? And if you do, then you are a fool, because it is not only men who fight when a fort is under attack. And no, it is not every woman who is such as I, who can point a rifle gun or a musket and kill whatever it is they point it at. But women fight in a battle. My own friend Molly had been running ball for 3 days straight during the battle. She had not slept, and there she was beside the fire, running ball. And she fell asleep, and with her hands under her chin, in her sleep, she cried out, "Give 'em hell, Billy! Let the lead rain down on them!" And that is what we did. We rained lead down on those savages, and we were successful. We ran them off like the dogs they are. They scampered back to the dark places from which they came. Huzzah! Huzzah! We had saved Fort Lee. Indeed. Huzzah! My husband and I, we traveled together for another year. And perhaps my greatest madness was thinking that I should be happy. Thinking that happiness and fine times would last. But they do not. And in 1784, my husband was murdered. I cannot speak of it. I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you more of that. And I was alone again. Always with my rifle gun at hand. Always on my own. It is a difficult life. Traveling still, fort to fort, tavern to tavern. And doing what needs must be done to earn a few pennies here, a dram there. And Colonel Clendenin at George came into Fort Lee at one day, and he had gotten it into his head that he would like to have a domesticated geese flock. Now let me tell you that domesticated is a fine word, but in practice it is not very useful when you pertain it to geese. But George said to me, "Anne, I desire to have a flock of geese, and I'll pay you. I'll pay you to go and to get it. But I want a dozen. It takes a dozen, and that is what I must have, or I'll not pay you." "Oh, la-ti-da," he says. I say to him. And so, off I go. I travel, and it is late fall going into winter, and I collect these geese, and I collect them, and domesticated they are not, but I gather them up, and on we go, back to the Clendenin settlement, Fort Lee. But along the way I was caught in a wretched blizzard, and I gathered up the flock around me, and I fell asleep. But on the morrow, when I awoke, I counted them up, and one was laying there frozen solid. I thought on George's words, and so I stuffed him into my pack. I had a wallet, and I stuffed him in there, and off I went back to George to collect my pay. Well, I arrive, and George Clendenin, oh, Colonel, he comes out, and he says, "Anne, didn't I make it quite explicit to you? I wanted to have a dozen, and I can count here 1, 2, 5, 7, 9. Oh, no, that is not 12. I'll not pay you then." And do you know, he did pay quite well after I flung that last goose at him. It was still frozen a bit, too. So it made a mark, and it made my point quite well. He paid. But that winter, it was a cold one, and I did not feel like traveling so much. I didn't feel like telling the stories. And yet, I made my home in a cave, and still people such as yourself, they came and they wanted to hear the stories. And they'd bring a wee dram. And I would tell them of the loves that I had had, the loves that I had lost. And I just did not feel as though I could get warm that winter. And there came a day when another man came, and I figured he'd be there to tell him a story, tell me how it was. But when he approached, and I looked at him, I knew it had to be my husband, and I thought to myself, have I died? And my husband Richard has come back to collect me. And I leaned toward him. That's when I knew. It was not my Richard. It was my William. My son. My son had found me. And though I could not forgive myself for having left him an orphan child, he had forgiven me. And he came to me. And he said to me, "Mother, I want you to come home." Home. A word that I had not considered for a long time. And when he said to me that he had grandchildren to present to me, I said, yes, I will go. I will go home with you, William. And I gathered up my scant belongings. My son and I, together, we walked, and I held his hand. And we soon arrived at a cabin, and the door had opened, and little children, they tumbled out. And didn't they have the blackest hair? And they came to me, and they said, "Grandmother, are you our grandmother?" Indeed I was. My son and I, we built a cabin that summer. We built it together just as my husband and I had done. I wanted my own home. And I think his wife wanted hers as well. But I built that home, and my grandchildren, they would come to me nigh on every day. And I remember well 'Twas November of 17. Oh, the days, the years, they go by so fast. 'Twas 1825. And I was there at the cabin, and my eldest granddaughters, they came to me and they said, "Grandma, come and tell us a story." And I said, "No, my dears, come, you come to me." And we all crawled into my bed, and I told them the stories of all that I had lost. And in their faces, I could see that all that I had lost, it had been returned to me tenfold in the eyes of my grandchildren. I gathered them close to me that night, and we fell asleep, they in my arms. And finally, I went to rest in peace. I believe that Anne Bailey lived by her wits. She lived by the stories that she told, just as I told you, from town to town, tavern to tavern. And she took stories and she made them her own. And I hope that the story that I've given you today, that I've made my own, brought Anne Bailey and brought that time back to life for you. Because that's what this is all about, is living history. So.
Well done. Huzzah.